I'm going to present in English some recent explorations that I've been conducting on this question of philosophy and nationalism, taking Derrida's very important text on philosophical nationalism as a point of departure. The way Derrida posed the problem as philosophical nationalism being philosophical in the sense that it is ontotheological, and demonstrating that ontotheology of not only a philosophical nationalism, but also the essential philosophicalness of all nationalisms, and perhaps the essential nationalisticness of all philosophy. This is very important for the work that Shaj Mohan and I had previously done on Gandhi, because Gandhi also is a peculiar thinker. We ourselves don't go so far as to call him a philosopher, but we find that Gandhi is a corpus, both a life, a body, a community, and a very large number of writings to which we give the name Gandhi. This corpus of Gandhi is also a corpus with which philosophy must have a necessary confrontation for a number of reasons. So I examine both Fichte's nationalism and cosmopolitanism, and also Derrida's construction of an ontotheological philosophical nationalism critically, by confronting it with a concept that Shaj Mohan and I had no choice but to develop in order to comprehend Gandhi and the role of Gandhi in thought, in the confrontation with modernity, which Gandhi did at the same time as thinkers like Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, Freud, Marx, and others, that epoch. But also because of the relation that Gandhi had and continues to indicate to nationalism in India and the contemporary politics in India, keeping in mind that India is the name of a region, perhaps a network of civilizations, which is most deeply determined by the caste order, which Shaj Mohan and I term the hypophysics of caste, and which I've been writing about as the racism of caste, exploring the extent to which there are different kinds of racism, and caste can be seen as one of those racisms. So this term hypophysics that we borrowed from Kant as a very undetermined term, barely determined, fleeting reference in the text of Kant in Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, became the name of a concept through which we could comprehend the way in which thought, philosophy, civilization, body, and caste and race come together in a kind of bundle for which Derrida was looking for his own name. So Derrida's project with respect to Fichte and philosophical nationalism is, for us philosophers, an ethical problem, which Derrida also calls a scandal. And the experience, the inheritance of history and of the denials of history that we have in India also poses for us ethical problems of the same order and scandals of the same order. I do believe that many of these problems and scandals with respect to this thing called India have not even begun to be confronted. I could summarize what I'm going to present in the form of two related questions. The Derridian question is there a philosophical nationalism? And I think here we are confronted with the philosophical responsibility, on the one hand, to reflect on the history of nationalism embedded in the history of philosophy. But I would like to join with it another question. And you can see, because of my concern with caste and race, why this question is necessary. This question was raised by an African philosopher, Emmanuel Ezer. I'm reformulating it in my own way. He had asked the question, how many brands of racism are there? And what does philosophical racism mean? Emmanuel Ezer was writing, of course, in connection with philosophers like Kant, Locke, Hume, and others. So I will reformulate this question as, is there a philosophical racism? So is there a philosophical nationalism, and is there a philosophical racism? And if we keep in mind the long history of racisms and race theories offered by philosophers and related thinkers in the in Kantian texts and in post-Kantian philosophical texts, then we can see that these two questions might be the same question or they are very closely related. And in the course of my presentation, I would like to propose that there are certain difficulties in Derrida's diagnosis of philosophical racism. And perhaps if we think about these problems through the term hypophysics, we might be able to see both the problems better with respect to the ethical responsibility we have to our own societies today, to the world today, but also we might be able to recognize some of the limitations of the tools, the probes, the antennae, as Frantz Fanon would call them, the antennae through which one feels the world, but in this case, the antennae through which we philosophize the problems in the history of philosophy and in our world. These two questions, is there a philosophical racism and is there a philosophical nationalism, are intimately related. I would like to quickly reconstruct the problem of the philosophy of nationalism that was posed, or the philosophy in the thought of the nation posed by Derrida in his first seminar in that series, and why he termed it a scandal, so that we can then see how we would have to read Fichte in a way slightly differently from Derrida. So Derrida says that the main problem is the relation of philosophy to language, and the relation of philosophy to the need to universalize and the need to be universal. And this problem becomes a scandal for Derrida, but also, as he says, the very chance of philosophy and even the very destiny of philosophy. And with Derrida, we are very conscious that we are considering both the past of philosophy and the future possibilities of philosophy. And in this sense, my effort here is very much continuous with the last writings of Jean-Luc Nancy on the question of the end of philosophy and the task of thinking. So Derrida's scandal and chance for philosophy at one and the same time is that philosophy must make an impossible choice to be universal and to posit itself, which Nancy also called the autofondation of philosophy, but also to speak to the world and to speak its own self in a language which must be a natural language. It must be the language of some people, some ethnos, some nation. It must be idiomatic, as Derrida said. And if philosophy withdraws away from this idiom, which is always the belonging or heritage of some people, perhaps of a nation, then philosophy will fall back into the error of using an externalized language as a tool for thought, and it will fall into yet another universalism of worldwide communicability, which Derrida wrote a lot about. And this is, of course, the problem often connected with Anglo-American traditions of philosophy, logic, and so on. But if philosophy gives in to the idiom, then it runs a further risk, which itself leads to a second level of problems, which is that philosophy will, on the one hand, speak a particular language, but in order to continue its responsibility to universalize, it will tend to be imperialist, as we have seen in the many critiques of the history of philosophy from the point of view that is often called decolonial and about which I have reservations, but also that philosophy would give into the Nazi heritages where a particular ethnicity or a particular identity of a folk or a people is treated as the only route, the only path, and the only idiom for philosophy to be done. And as we know very well, Fichte is the prime example of that in privileging the German language, but Heidegger is the next major example of that. And so to me, the problem is connected between Fichte, Heidegger, and also internationally Gandhi, because Gandhi is not an Indian thinker. He is a thinker first received internationally, feted in places like the United States, South Africa, and above all in France. So Derrida summarizes the way in which Fichte expresses this scandal but also chance of philosophy in the following way, which is Derrida says, the national problem, as we will have ceaselessly to verify, is not one problem among others, nor one philosophical dimension among others. We know at least this much: it is a minimal but indubitable predicate, namely that the affirmation of a nationality and even the claim of nationalism does not happen to philosophy by chance or from the outside. It is essentially and thoroughly philosophical. It is a philosophy. And so nationalism is essentially philosophical, and they both form a philosophy. And we can immediately see that they also form a philosophy in a binary construction, because philosophy is still popularly thought to be the possible antidote to racisms. And yet philosophy has been racist in a certain part of the history of philosophies. Certainly in Europe and certainly in India. In India for a much longer time than in Europe. So I'm going to ask why Derrida constituted this philosophy of philosophy and nationalism and its scandal by treating nation as nothing racist or ethnic or empirical or innate. In other words, Derrida says that nation is already a philosophy which is non-empirical, non-natural, and that is why it has essentially to do with the philosophical drive to go beyond nature, to rise above the ethnic, the people or the state or race or culture. So in order to construct this philosophy, Derrida made a decision to separate race, nature, ethnicity from nation. We can ask whether this is ever the case, but immediately I would like to go to Fichte to show that this is not the case even in Fichte. And some scholarship before Derrida wrote had acknowledged it, perhaps not in a very detailed way. And it's possible that I may not have gone through all the resources that may exist there in Fichte's reception. But even after Derrida's intervention, we find that the large part of Fichte's scholarship continues this premise that the nation and Fichte's definition of nation and of language is not really racist or not based in a natural concept. So it's not certain that all nationalism, and certainly Fichte's German nation in the address to the German people in 1806, are ontotheological in the way Heidegger defined the word, nor is this nationalism non-natural or non-racist in the way that Derrida showed it. Derrida invites us to infer that nationalism is ontotheological in Fichte by going to this statement from Fichte. Whoever believes in spirituality and in the freedom of spirituality, the national principle, who wills the eternal development of the spirituality by freedom, wherever he may be born and whatever language he speaks, is of our blood, ist unseres Geschlecht. That's the word, Geschlecht. Is with us, is of our race, family, genealogy, filiation, almost sex. I'm quoting Fichte as quoted in Derrida, in the English translation. And so the co-dwelling of freedom and of a concern with the cosmopolis and of spirituality together within a folk, is going to grant membership to anyone and everyone into this thing called German nation, or this philosophical nation, is unseres Geschlecht. And Derrida then continues to analyze this in terms of an archaeoteleology, because the German speakers, the born German speakers, are intended for a philosophical future. And at the same time, this future depends of a decision or an affirmation consciously made for freedom and spirituality. And therefore, the arche can be reiterated with the teleology that will repeat the arche. And this is an apt term, archaeoteleology, although I would eventually suggest a modification, a different term for it. And so Derrida concludes that such an affirmation is thoroughly philosophical and is even philosophy itself, since Fichte finds the Germans to be constituted by their very language and therefore their nationality for transporting the whole world to the spirit of freedom, which presumably is a philosophical spirit. And that this very construction of a language and people-based philosophical mission is the ground of Fichte's cosmopolitanism, and I would add it's also the ground of his Bildung program, his educational program with respect to the German university. And Derrida rightly identifies this as the source of a hierarchizing evaluation. It's a term used in his text. And we should bear in mind here that just a couple of years or so before Derrida published these or made these seminars, Louis Dumont had published a study of Fichte in which he had emphasized this hierarchizing spirit, esprit hiérarchique, Dumont had observed. And that is just one more reason why we must study Fichte, German Romanticism, the history of philosophy as conceived by Heidegger, Derrida's critique of it, with a study of India and of what has been written about India, what has been borrowed from India in Europe. I will come back to it, because Louis Dumont is also the famous sociologist who wrote about Homo hierarchus, a study of the caste system, of the hierarchy of castes in India. So Derrida certainly was performing a very heroic gesture of confronting philosophy with its racism and making us think that the imperialist and discriminatory character of many cosmopolitanisms should make us step back from the assumption that philosophers can provide straightforward solutions to this long history of racism or of Nazism or fascism. And yet, the demonstration that Derrida makes from Fichte is disturbing because it implicates philosophy's essence necessarily in nationalism only because it ignores Fichte's elaboration of the nativity of the spiritual nation. In other words, Derrida is not correct in defining the nation of philosophy as a non-natural and non-racist nation. I would like to demonstrate the opposite. There is something inside Fichte that Derrida did not attend to, which is the nativity of the cosmopolitan imperial language nation. And that is precisely the reading of the term Geschlecht. He conceives Geschlecht in Fichte as non-biological, non-innate. Now, the very concept of nature, of natus in the nation, nation, is a vision of birth, of natus, and of folk, which would be the nation. And of course, nature is a highly polysemic term. We would need to locate the precise definitions in the different texts of philosophy and outside philosophy, in anthropology, philology, and so on. And Leon Polyakov had already noted that in the long epoch leading up to Nazism, in the many texts of the German Romantics who were all building race theories, but also the racial anthropologists, how little distinction was made, I'm quoting Polyakov, how little distinction was made between the criteria of language and of race. But I think while across the texts and the thinkers of Europe who were engaged in building both the theories of nation, especially German nation, and theories of race at one and the same time, if we confine ourselves to Fichte's text, we don't have to be intimidated by the polysemy of nature, because Fichte was at pains to give us his definition of the nature of German language and of German people. So if natus etymologically, at its deepest core, in any of the polysemic definitions, speaks of birth. In other words, anything which is natural is so because it retains the characteristics imbued in it by birth. Then nation and any, the entire semantic field of possibilities of nature, natus, nation, should first of all be understood from the concept of birth and of retaining that which one is born as. We can go back here beyond the Latin term natus to the Greek term physis. And this is where Shaj Mohan and I suggest the word hypophysics, because as compared to metaphysics, which has several important definitions in the history, including up to Heidegger, which Derrida invokes, what we have here is the idea that we are and we remain archaeoteleologically what we were born as, what we were made as. And if the value of the possibility of philosophizing, the value in the possibility of attaining spirituality or freedom is finally to be located in our birth, then we can say that this value is under or within or beneath nature. It cannot be extricated from nature. It is not independent from nature. It is not separable from nature. It is intrinsic to nature. And in this sense, we used or we read into this slender Kantian term an etymology, hypophysis, within nature. And we will find in Fichte's conception of language and of the German people and the potential for philosophy, it is buried and inseparable within the nature, the born character of the folk in the German folk. So Fichte's hyperphysics is unequivocal in positing a natural law, the term is Naturgesetz, which grounds nation and language, and therefore also grounds his Bildung program and his imperial cosmopolitanism in the same source. And the word source, it is also cited by Derrida. In Fichte, it is das Ursprüngliche, which goes back to so many discussions of that which is born, the origin. But not simply the source whose divine, göttliches character functions as the seed from inception to eternity of each man, unless it is corrupted by mixtures. And this is where we will see Fichte's objection to the other European peoples and languages which have corrupted themselves with too much influence of Latin and of other languages. So he is opposed to mixture in language as also the seed of mixture in thinking and the impossibility of being free. And Fichte links this divine göttliches character of the Ursprüngliche in the Naturgesetz in each individual in the way that they are born. And he emphasizes that it is determined racially through the physical ancestry. He uses the term Abstammkunft. This is just one of the many models of Abstammkunft or racial ancestry, which was explored by different European thinkers at that time. And this ancestry also belongs to or lives as the nation from which each individual is descended. The word is das Volk, von welchem abstammt. So Abstammkunft refers to the born nature because we receive something from our group when we are born. Biological reproduction is central to the Redens to Fichte's argument. It furnishes the fundamental bond of the national individuals, even before the spiritual production of Kultur does its own work. And even before and through the first acquisition of language. So rather than interfere with the natural disposition of the individual national spirit in each of us, language grounds this natural disposition through a fundamental law. There is no opposition between nature and language in Fichte, as we will find in some later thinkers. And that's why he also uses the term fundamental law or Grundgesetz, because the Grundgesetz of language and of race is instituted in the same nature in the individual body and also in the body of the natural objects in our geographical location. So Fichte is not simply speaking about a linguistic nationalism as one might construe in Herder or later in Humboldt. And I think each of these have to be revisited, and not even in Heidegger. But geography as the determinant of race and language is central to Fichte. So I will read this citation in English. Language in general, particularly the designation of objects, the way we name objects, through the production of sound in the speech organs, does not by any means depend on arbitrary decrees and conventions. Language is not arbitrary for Fichte. Rather, there exists in the first instance a fundamental law, according to which each concept is expressed by this sound and no other through the human speech organs. Our speech organs can make particular sounds which others can't, other races cannot. And our speech organs make this particular sound because they are born in a particular soil, in a particular region, and they were developed, the sounds were developed for the specific objects of and the natural objects of that region. And for Fichte, this first happens sensuously and then at the suprasensuous level. And this is something that Derrida does not bring into his definition of philosophical nationalism and language and idiom in his seminar. It is under the same specific natural process of language formation that racial differentiation of speech organs is originally present in each folk, also because of their interaction with these natural objects in the geographical domain, and also because of the common life with each other, who are each constructed with the same speech organs in the particular habitat that they share through their descent. This means through geographical, reproductive, and cultural isolation. So he uses the word äußeren Einflüssen, and I will cite again, if we call a people those men whose speech organs are subject to the same external influences, who live together and develop their language in continuous communication, then we must say, language of this people is as it is by necessity, not by culture, first of all. So a natural language can be the best vehicle of Bildung and of philosophy. It is not shaped by them. Language of this people is as it is by necessity, and it is not really the people that express their knowledge, but rather knowledge that expresses itself through the people. We are simply channels for this Grundgesetz, which is racial. The apparent humanity reflected in the monogenesis of all humans is also naturally assured of its distinctive characteristics or permanent racial differences, as we found in Kant. And we can explore further to what extent Fichte was relying on a monogenetic or a polygenetic account here. But the way it is expressed in the address to the German nation would not change much. It's not just the rest of the body, but also language and therefore also civilizational capabilities, which are determined, and finally, therefore, spiritual life. Der ewigen Fortdauer des Volkes, the eternal continuance of the nation. This is what Derrida called archaeoteleology in Fichte. But if we acknowledge that this is not non-natural, but it is thoroughly natural in a peculiar hypophysical sense, then we may need another term than archaeoteleology and ontotheology to grasp what is the mode of thought here. Derrida ignored this explicitly formulated nation, which, when grounded in nature as external conditions, is nothing other than race. And here, therefore, we are not caught in the polysemy of the word Geschlecht, because Fichte explains it for us. Fichte, therefore, continues to use the term life of the Volk, the living language, lebendige Sprache, and both life and language in Fichte are hypophysical. He goes on to say that it is not a value that is added to nature, or we find that this living quality or spiritual quality of the German language is not added to nature, but is already there in an unmediated form. The Fichte term is unmittelbar. Spricht unmittelbar der Geist. The spirit speaks unmediated in language, and Derrida's entire analysis is built on the thought of a mediation. And even the sign in the living language speaks unmittelbar. So we find the contrary of Derrida's claim, and I'm quoting Derrida, that national identity is never posited as natural and that nationalism never presents itself as a particularism. I don't think it would be possible to agree with Derrida here. So Geschlecht is race and biology, and only thereby is it immediately, unmittelbar, also spirit, with a cosmopolitan scope for Fichte. Such a spirit, then, we can call not ontotheological, because it does not meet the criteria of ontotheology as defined by Heidegger in relation to nature, but rather it is hypophysical. And to that extent, we are confronted with a question. In being hypophysical, is it philosophical or not? If, again, we remember that Derrida must be using the definition of philosophy as ontotheology, which comes from Heidegger. For Fichte, this is the principle of a divine nature which determines the biology in advance and also secures the inner boundaries, the inneren Grenzen. This is also in the title of a study of the same subject made by Etienne Balibar. But the inner boundaries are inner, I would suggest, in the sense of hypo. They are in the nature. They don't come from outside. And through one and the same channel of Fluss, of biological reproduction and common or communal life. And this is where Fichte goes on to ascribe to this Geschlecht a göttliches or a divine character. He says the divine has appeared in the people, and that which is original has deemed it worthy to make this its vesture, its attire or habitat, to make this its vesture and direct means of flowing into the world. Therefore, the divine will break further forth from it. In other words, if we can affirm our German nature and language, then the divine will break forth from us and we would be more capable of freedom and of philosophy. Such immediacy is hypophysics. This Naturgesetz, which is geistiger, is also the natürliche Geist, the natural spirit or the spiritual nature. And this immediacy conserves the nature of a thing immediately through its birth onwards to its perfection. In fact, Fichte says to make itself into what it ought to be, to renew the covenant and to close its ranks. In other words, not to allow a corruption of the gift that nature has given. I would now like to come to the way in which this hypophysical theory of nature and language and spirit in Fichte leads to his conception of nationalism and then to philosophy of freedom. So the hypophysical nation is in communion with itself through nature even before any art. I'm paraphrasing Fichte. The drive for and in this life, if it remains undisturbed by the wrong artifice of mixing education, foreign influence, it will determine even the desire for remaining isolated. And Fichte says that these people, such a folk or band, they are naturally together, one and whole, and they would not even desire to mix with people of any other language or nature. And I think this only goes to show how Fichte fulfills every character of race theory and racism while having a distinct race theory and racism of his own, which Derrida keeps out of his reckoning. The deviation from this nature through adoption of another language would be a denaturation of life. In that sense, if denaturation or a going beyond nature is conceived by Fichte, then that doesn't make him philosophical, it makes him anti-philosophical by Derrida's definition. On the contrary, Fichte's definition of philosophy is that it must remain with nature, not transcend it as Derrida defined philosophy and nation. Fichte refers to this as the sealing hypophysically in nature of what is given through political decisions and cultural decisions. Culture and politics in the service of a hypophysical nature and hypophysical destiny. Fichte calls it a joy sacrifice, a sacrifice to the nation and thus to oneself, not sacrificing to another, honoring the self in honoring the nation which has given birth to that man. And it is in this sacrifice that we can now locate the Fichtean concept of freedom. It is not a freedom from nature, but a freedom to affirm nature. It is a decision that is made to be what you were born as. In hypophysics, a thing is at the purest of its intrinsic value when it does not deviate from, but rather affirms its nature and adheres to its nature at every moment. We will see this also in Gandhi, although I will go over it very briefly to show these strong analogues between the two thinkers, that it is because there is a particular group which must preserve itself in this way, but is constantly threatened by the world beyond its geographical isolation and its spiritual isolation. This threat from the outside has to be met with a freely chosen decision at each time, not to be swept by the spirit of history, as Hegel would have thought it, but to have the spirit to affirm through a decision what one is. And the deviations from nature can therefore be judged as corrupt, as evil, as a denaturing. We find this also in Gandhi. And so in Fichte also, the racial hierarchy, in fact, corresponds to what I would call, based on the Gandhi work with Shaj Mohan, a scaleology. That there is a scale of how true we are to our nature and how foreign we become to our nature. And we can measure our value in terms of where we stand on the scale of deviations. We would be the best if we could choose to remain what we were born as. And therefore, there is a scaleology, such as all race theories have a scaleology, a scale of characteristics, a hierarchy. And this, I think, would explain what Derrida was exploring through the term hierarchizing spirit. We've caste system is precisely such a scaleology that has existed for 3,000 years in India. So the most superior nation is the one that has not deviated from the Ursprüngliche, from the source, because it has not mixed its race, its tongue, its culture, and above all, its common life. In accordance with this logic, its life is not denatured. If a nation is at the purest of its value, while other nations go around mixing and allowing foreign influences, then this purest nation can be the leader of all nations and can show them the way. It is from this point that Fichte can also posit the German nation as the leader of a new cosmopolis, as the teacher of the whole world. We should, of course, remember here the Schlegel's phrase about India that one day, Germany will be the Orient of Europe. And the Orient that he referred to was India. We can see this again in Max Müller, Friedrich Max Müller, who said, "What can India teach us?" Another part of my work published last year has to do with precisely this. India taught Europe the caste system. But that's an aside. Coming back, therefore, to Derrida's reading of Fichte's scaleology, if we miss the game of nature in Fichte, then we would not perceive the way in which this scaleology is based on what Derrida called the archaeoteleology of Fichte. So Derrida registered a surprise at the apparent equivocality of the signs by which Fichte's living philosophy of freedom would be denatured by a philosophy of nature. Of course, that's the old debate between nature and freedom, Fichte, Schelling, etc. But can we agree with Derrida that nature is said in two voices in Fichte? I think Fichte is very unequivocal in his definition of nature. And so I don't find an equivocality of science as Derrida did. A hypophysical nature is always unequivocally said. It speaks itself as the spirit. It asserts that it is divine, and hypophysics always judges other definitions of nature. And Fichte does the same for the philosophy of nature. He judges it to be corrupting, as a denaturing. So hypophysics does not compete with other theories of nature. It judges them. It puts them in its own scale of good, bad, or good and evil, as the case may be. Fichte, for instance, says, this is his love for his people. At first, he respects, trusts, and rejoices in it, in his people, takes pride in his descent from it. And then he is active, effective, sacrificing himself on behalf of his people. But a sacrifice of this kind is not only oriented to the actions towards his own people, it will be oriented towards fighting off the bad influences from other people. So the racism as institutional actions with respect to other peoples or to one's own peoples, for instance, endogamy, curtailing of sexual freedom, and so on, they all flow from the scaleology that is built upon a hypophysics and which judges other theories of nature. So the sacrifice is also the punishment that follows by judging that certain other races or other groups or other philosophers are in the wrong party. And Fichte did that in the way also in which he invoked or wrote about the Jewish people and the Jewish way of thinking as the enemies of cosmopolitanism and of a universal common humanity. And Robert Bernasconi finds that this may have been, this engagement of Fichte's may have been one of the vital sources of Kant's own anti-Semitic cosmopolitanism, but that's a separate thing. So coming to Gandhi, the most elaborate hypophysics that we have known today, but who knows, some further work on Fichte might give us another competing hypophysics. It comes to us from M.K. Gandhi, which in the early 20th century declared that morality is natural, in that remaining how we are made is the most moral thing to do. And deviating from nature is immoral, deviating from the nature that has been made for each thing by God. God defined here as the maker. We know that even theologically, there are many conceptions of God. So deviating from this God-made nature, for instance, through social or technological innovations or aesthetic and artistic innovations, is the birth of evil, and nature will judge and punish it. And as we know, in every race theory and every such hypophysics, some people will take up the task to act on nature's behalf, to punish and judge other people. So knowledge itself, such as the modern sciences, which seek a theory of nature, of pure physics, not hypophysics, separate nature from morality, separate nature from value, by means of thinking as an act of thought. All such knowledges are a denaturation of nature, and Gandhi called them evil. Hence, his own educational program and communal program for the true independent life in India, which he called Swaraj. It was a program that rejected modern sciences, modern education, and also said that philosophy was satanic, as was the whole of Western civilization. And hence, very analogous to Fichte, Gandhi declared that peoples who did not practice what we call Gandhi's hypophysical morality, when confronted with evils such as colonialism, had become extinct. Here we see a second parallel with Fichte, namely that it's not enough to resist the influence of mixtures and accelerations coming from the West to India. But if Indians or if any other people who were colonized and similarly epistemologically colonized by Europe, if they did not resist by returning to their own nature, by completely rejecting Western culture, they would all perish. It would be nature's way of showing that they were not worthy of surviving. And so Gandhi often spoke of a kind of autolysis of the people who did not have the right anti-colonialism. And we know that there are many kinds. I think Gandhi would have rejected the Fanonian anti-colonialism. And hence Gandhi too was positing the Indian way of resisting global colonialism as the best way. And he said that the most moral people were those of Hind or India, who since immemorial times had remained within hypophysical restrictions, almost like the inneren Grenzen of Fichte, the restrictions of their actions, including the restrictions, the interdictions on travel, on sexual mixing, through endogamy of caste, through the strictures of caste and religion, eating with people who are not their own, converting to other religions. All of this was prohibited by India. So Indian civilization was the best equipped to prevent any mixture and to keep people at their hypophysical best. And in this sense, civilization, in Fichte's case, philosophy and education, must assist nature rather than oppose nature. And Gandhi defended, therefore, the caste system. He was one of the most trenchant supporters of the caste system most of his life, based on his hypophysics. As we know, the caste system was a system of sexual, reproductive, occupational, educational, and all other manners of divisions, inequalities, which maintained and sought to maintain total isolation of groups according to their birth, natus, or according to their descent, Abstammkunft. Rather than an injustice, Gandhi considered caste to be the genius. He used this word. It was the genius of India and the core of Hindu religion. Gandhi called it Sanatana. It's a term that has existed in Sanskrit and invoked from time to time, but became the name of Hindu religion in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Sanatana means eternal. Here we see what Derrida would call archaeoteleology, but a hypophysical archaeoteleology needs another name, and I'll come to it if there is time. That the eternal continuation of his own people in Fichte finds its analogue in Gandhi's eternal devotion to the religion which is crafted to preserve one's birth and descent. And Gandhi could even say that there is a lot of humbug in Hindu religion, superstition, and I don't mean religion in their conventional or traditional particularities, but religion with a capital R. Everywhere in the world, there must be a religion that corresponds to the hypophysics of nature. And of course, the version of this eternal or Sanatana Dharma that Gandhi proposed was in accordance with the trends of the Brahmanical self-assertion of his time. This Brahmanical self-assertion continues today in the form of the national government and the party in power in India. In fact, today they reject even the word Hindu, but say that we want to preserve the majority people of India as Sanatana Dharma. It has survived for millennia against all invasions and contacts with other peoples. And very much like Fichte, Gandhi also appreciated and valued the fact that we must preserve ourselves from foreign influences. And so the religion or the monotheisms which tried to convert everyone, and that kind of universalism was already rejected. But a new universalism was proposed even by Gandhi when he said that India could lead the world. So Gandhi compared Indian civilization and its stability, its eternity, to those other victims of colonization, like the indigenous people of Australia, Africa, and he found them to be to have lost out, to have dwindled and to have died, not because of colonial genocides, but because they did not know the right way to resist the colonizer. He put the blame on the victims of colonization rather than on genocidal colonization. He said that if these indigenous peoples had practiced hypophysical Gandhian morality as Indians had, then they would have survived, as Indians will. The eternal survival of Indians and their caste system. So Fichte's eternal nation would function with its own scalology of the living German language philosophy and the dead language nations like France, Britain, and the ancient Greeks. And Fichte says something very similar. They all perished. They could not survive because the living force had extirpated. So what is the connection then between language and philosophy in Fichte? Fichte's hypophysics of nature language explained why the only means of maintaining the eternity of the nation and of offering it as the philosophical salvation of humanity had to be the German nation. Now, this is what Derrida calls national humanism, that the nation should offer a philosophical salvation to all humanity, but it must come from one nation and go to all humanity. Derrida called that national humanism. But in whatever way such philosophy should singularly arise only in German and in German language, which is divinely bestowed, we cannot, like Derrida, call it secularized, nor is it sacred in the sense of something set apart, sacré. It is hypophysical. It is a natural outgrowth divinely planted in nature, including in the human body, and hence this attempt to find a secret idiom, as Derrida called it. And by secret idiom, he also elaborated the way in which what Fichte called language was not exactly language, and what Fichte called nation was not nation, Geschlecht or race was not race. And Derrida maintained an equivocity for these terms, calling them a secret idiom. And of course, he was also referring to the idea of the secret Germany, which was being discussed in Fichte's time. But when we read Fichte, we don't find a secret idiom. Everything is manifest and is given in a mechanical precision of Fichte's own logic. So the Fichtean proposition for the relation between philosophy and nation can be broken down in the following two propositions. One, only first philosophy, that is Wissenschaftslehre, which is also practical philosophy for Fichte. Only first philosophy is philosophy, and only German language use can philosophize. But not every use of German language. It's only a particular use of German language in philosophy in the service of a philosophy of spirit, and particularly first philosophy. So the particular language is fixed so that the spirit can progress along its natural flux through its leading philosopher, which is Fichte himself. There is no metaphysical distinction between an essential and inward Deutsch and the empirical and outward Deutsch, as Derrida thought. These formulae of equivocation only hide the hypophysics of Fichte, which is guaranteed in the spiritual nature. And therefore, universalist philosophy of freedom is the Göttliches. It is destined to break forth and speak itself only in German, thus fulfilling the so-called secret idiom. But at that point, it will not remain very secret. So there is no tension between Fichte's claim to metaphysics and to empirical nation language. Fichte himself provides the hypophysical bridge between the metaphysical character of the first philosophy, Wissenschaftslehre, and the way in the justification that only German language can undertake such a philosophy and then teach it to the rest of the world. Rather, instead of an equivocation or a tension between the metaphysics and the language and nature, there is only a delay. In other words, just like in many other racist thinkers, including Gandhi, there is always a temporal process or a temporal period of praxis in which the possibilities of nature must be deployed in order to conduct the philosophy which will make us close to nature. So the toleration of the German speakers who were not German, who did not philosophize like Fichte. So it's not simply a linguistic criteria, but it's that they must philosophize like Fichte. And they were Hamann, Jacobi, Schelling, and others. This would prolong the degeneration and also impede the destiny of philosophy. the hyperphysical continuity of German speakers through geographical isolation and through the highest degree of purity of descent among all the Teutons until now had kept alive this destiny. And so this has also been noticed by other Fichte scholars, that Fichte's criteria for this purity is also that it's the Teutons amongst all the, it's the degree of purity of the Germans among all the Teutons and of Teuton descent that raises them in the possibility of philosophy, and that the Germans are the special Teutons who have kept this possibility in its dormancy. It must break forth now. So the national education to enliven, enliven, to bring life to this preserved German seed, preserved only in the German amongst the Teutons, to be cultivated and propagated to the whole world without ceasing to be eternal. This is the German nation, and it must be a programmed one. The German people have it in them, but they cannot be allowed to passively express this. In fact, that seed will be destroyed through the influx. And hence the Bildung or the educational program proposed by Fichte, at least, and here is my last question to myself and to all of us concerned with the relation between philosophy and nation. Those of us who are not practitioners of first philosophy or Wissenschaftslehre, as Kant was not, those of us who are not Fichten idealists, we at least should consider withdrawing the word philosophical from the nationalism of Fichte. Unlike Derrida, we can consider not allowing this term to Fichte. There is nothing philosophical in the nationalism of Fichte. There is nothing metaphysical in the nationalism, but something hyperphysical. Each of us as philosophers have the possibility to reject not only Fichte's hyperphysics, but also to reject Fichte's definition of philosophy. In other words, unlike Derrida, we can consider whether this is an internal relation, destinal relation at all. We could separate the philosophy and the nationalism for ourselves. We could revolt against Fichte's imperial pedagogy. One remembers Schlegel's joke about Napoleon, that Napoleon was a certain Fichte in Jena. That tells us about the Fichtean program. Here we come to the term we. Of course, when we speak as us philosophers, we admit the plurality of our philosophical effort at every point, but also some kind of common concern that brings us together, whether in disagreement, in critique, in deconstruction, or in dialogue. It does not make of us a homogeneous we, and it need not make of us an archaeoteleological we. So Derrida, in fact, used the term archaeoteleological in order to speak about the we, unseres Geschlecht, uns in Fichte. But it's not because, as Derrida found, that there is a performativity of address instituted in the we by Fichte, but rather because there is a Bildung which functions as analogous to caste in Fichte. It trains the leading nation, a nation which is itself led by the right, religion, and morality, to live the future in perfect identity and continuity with the past. So this perfect identity, continuity, and repetition of the past from the seed to eternity, we found that in Gandhi, we find that in Fichte, and we could say that this is something more than identity. Perhaps the framework of identity with which we often analyze these problems is insufficient. And of course, identity itself is a very deep problem in metaphysics, which Shaj Mohan works on, and that requires its own separate work. So what we have in hypophysical thinking is more than identity. It is the repetition identically to contain all deviations, to treat all deviations, to cut all deviations, if there is going to be a future. So the future which contains deviations should be killed in order to preserve and activate the only future which was already programmed in nature, in birth, and in the past, in the arche. But this exertion has to be freely chosen repetition, which counteracts the ills. And therefore, following the metaphor of Odysseus, who was isolated by Calypso's spell in Homer's epic, we use the word calypsology, the kind of spell under which Odysseus forgets that he can leave the island and adventure in any direction, whether he goes home or from home he goes to further adventures, which he does in the epic, in fact. It's not an epic of homecoming in that sense. Man's ability to be polynomial in the sense of being subject to or giving to himself multiple laws, to constitute himself or herself as capable of being regulated by multiple laws, multiple nomos, and by new laws, and hence polynomial. Man is trapped in the island of hypophysics, where a spell of hypophysics tries to teach him or her that this is where he was born and this is what he must repeat for eternity. And he must go out of his way to remain the same. Instead of archaeoteleology, I would propose to call this hypophysical operation calypsology, the logos of calypsos, affirming the self-repetition as the means to remaining the self as the end. The means and ends are fused into each other. So the Fichtean end is also that blood has maximum force, blood through which identification transmits the forms of flesh, of speech, and also the possibility of the philosophy of freedom, the philosophy of spirit. And hence there is a reciprocal immurement or identification of means and ends, which is calypsological in Fichte's German, because the Germans, having never wished to mix, have maintained and evidenced their racial, lingual, spiritual purity of descent, unlike other white people. And we must consider to what extent Heidegger remained also the legatee of many of these different ways of thinking. It's the same, this is what would make Fichte's Germans, the Urvolk, most suitable to rule the world, just as Gandhi had said that India would teach self-rule to the world. And so we come back to the quotation that we started with, Fichte's quotation in Derrida's text: whoever believes in spirituality and in the freedom of this spirituality, who wills the eternal development of this spirituality by freedom, freedom as the means, for the spirit as the end, but the spirit is the one at the origin. Whoever wishes that to attain this eternal development of spirituality by freedom, wherever he may have been born and whatever language he speaks, he is of our blood, is with us, is of our race, family, genealogy, filiation. Es gehört uns an und es wird sich zu uns tun. Thank you.